One. My guest today is Alan Mikhail, and he has written several books on the Ottoman Empire, including Animals in the Ottoman Empire, and his most recent book, God's Shadow, about Sultan Selim the Grim, which we are going to talk about today. And what inspired you to start studying the Ottoman Empire?
I got interested in the Ottoman Empire because, in the most broadest sense, I was interested in the history of the Middle East in what we call the early modern period, so roughly 1500 to 1800. This is a period that's crucial for the formation of what will come later, obviously, the modern Middle East. And in general, was a period, I don't think this is still the case, but over the past 50 years was a period that wasn't as heavily studied as, say, the 19th century. So I was curious as to how we sort of got to our current moment.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in that period and that place, the Ottoman Empire is obviously crucial, since that was the major political force in the Middle East over the course of these centuries. And it also struck me, as I kept reading and reading over the years, that the Ottomans were crucial to not just the Middle East, but to the world in these centuries, between 1500 and 1800 again. And so in my previous work, I was interested in the impacts of the Ottoman Empire in Egypt, for example, and in other places in the Middle East. And in this book, God's Shadow, I really took my charge to be understanding part of the impact of the Ottoman Empire on global history in a circumscribed period at the turn of the 16th century.
And in the first part of the book, you started talking about the Ottoman influence in Europe, and it is you talked about how the Ottomans inspired and it's pretty brutal how the Portuguese found the Americas, and you explained it sounds pretty brutal when they seem to be look at the new Native Americans as Muslims themselves. Can you talk a little bit about how the Ottomans influenced the new journey to Americas?
Right. So the period of study in the book is really the 50 years of the life of the main protagonist of the book, Sultan Selim. He lives from 1470 to 1520. So if we think about some of the major world events in that period, obviously 1492 looms very large in that story. And 1492 in the book, and maybe we'll get into this, has multiple meanings, right? It's not just the European voyages across the Atlantic. It's also the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. But to answer your question, I was interested in how the Ottoman-Spanish rivalry was a piece of the Atlantic voyages. So how can we think about that? If we take the major figure that is usually associated with the voyages, Columbus, we can narrate some of this history. So Columbus is born in 1451, just 2 years before the Ottomans seized Constantinople from the Byzantine Empire in 1453. For Columbus and for that generation of Europeans, that conquest by the Ottomans in 1453 was a major geopolitical event, a major religious event in their minds, eschatological event, and a major economic event. And they saw it as one of the popes famously described it as plucking out one of the eyes of Christianity, the Eastern kingdom, the Eastern capital of Christianity. So the Ottomans, after 1453, even more so than they were before, are seen as an encroaching force on the European continent. That ramps up over the second half of the 15th century as the Ottomans push further west in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm sorry, in the Mediterranean, not in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. across North Africa, and then into some of the islands into the Mediterranean, butting up against Italian, Spanish, Portuguese influence in the sea. And for someone like Isabella in Spain, this idea of an encroaching Islam coming from the East is very alive in her mind, especially as there are Muslims in Iberia itself. So for someone like Columbus, who was born in Genoa in 1451, this is a place in which crusaders would have left to fight against various Muslim polities in the East to try to, as the Christians would say, reconquer Jerusalem. This is a place, Genoa, that suffered economically from the Ottoman conquest in the Black Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean, cutting off some vital mercantile ports that people in Genoa and other places in Europe had made lots of money in over the previous centuries. So this is a major event in the lives of these people. If we think in a different way about Columbus, we know that as a young man, he read works by people like Marco Polo and other works that described the East in usually very fantastical ways. So if we take Marco Polo described a Grand Khan of the East. This is someone who was vaguely in China, as Marco Polo described it, who had some interest in Christianity, who wasn't yet a Christian, but might convert to Christianity and therefore bring all of his subjects to Christianity, surrounding Muslims in the Middle East that would allow European Christians and then these Christians in the East to crush Islam in the middle, reclaim Jerusalem, and allow Christ to march upon the earth. Columbus, in his teenage years, took to various voyages across the Mediterranean Sea, some of which brought him in contact with the Ottomans in the Aegean and with a Muslim kingdom in North Africa, in Tunis. And there he was able to sort of put some meat on the bones of this fictional understanding of Islam that he had gained as a child. All of this reinforced this idea that Islam was this encroaching, powerful force. So if we think of these multiple levels in which, in the case of Columbus, just to use him as a kind of archetype of the European imagination in this period, Islam was a foreboding political, religious, and economic force. To overcome it, Europeans needed to find ways around it, right? So finding an alternative route to trade with Asia, because Muslims were in the middle, right, in the Middle East, blocking Europeans from reaching places like India and China. That there was a need to circumvent Muslim power in the middle. And there was also a kind of deeper theological motivation for someone like Columbus. He really saw these efforts as one of crusade against Muslim kingdoms. And you see this in the language that he used, in the way that he justifies his voyages to various potential patrons, in the way that as he's sailing along the West African coast with a group of Portuguese sailors, they talk about the presence of Islam in West Africa. This language of crusade really saturates a lot of Christian writing about others, not just Muslims, but others in the second half of the 15th century. And as you suggested, this language of crusade against Islam and other non-Christians goes with the conquistadors when they arrive in what we today call the Caribbean. And there they use a language of crusade, and specifically a language of Islam, to describe native peoples that they encounter in the Caribbean. So for example, Columbus describes Taino women as somehow being akin to Moorish women, Muslim women. He describes the weapons that Taino soldiers use as akin to the kinds of swords that Muslim soldiers in Spain used in their battles. A few decades later, Cortez in Mexico uses the language of Islam to describe 400 mosques in Mexico. Of course, there were no mosques. These are most likely Aztec structures, Aztec temples that he's describing. But the fact that he uses this language of Islam is very important. He describes Montezuma, the great Aztec leader, as a sultan, and there are many other examples of this. So I was interested in this kind of long narrative of how an encounter in the old world between Islam and Christendom impacts, affects, shapes in real ways the very fact that an alternative route to Asia is being sought by Europeans in the first place, and then how they come to understand, filter this new place that some of them don't think is new. Some of them think they're in Asia, but others think they're in a new place.
You mentioned that Columbus never got to find out that there was actually new land, that he thought it was India until he died, right?
That's right. Until he dies in 1506, he thinks that he's reached Asia. He just doesn't know where in Asia yet he's landed. But there are others during Columbus's lifetime, and then of course after, who describe this as not being Asia, as being a completely new territory that they've discovered.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I actually wanted to draw back a little bit, because in the book as well, you mentioned that they're pretty close to mutiny, that the crew wanted to turn back and turn on Columbus. How close were they to not finding this new land?
Well, I mean, there are, any number of ways in which this voyage could have been disastrous. They, for example, they sail during prime hurricane season across the Atlantic. A hurricane could have downed their ship very easily. They could have been blown back. They could have gotten lost. There could have been disease on any number of things could have stopped this from being any kind of landfall. They were lucky in many ways.
And how do they treat, because you mentioned a lot of, again, I would say that they do talk a lot about them being Islam, and that they are Muslims and not Native Americans, that they actually come to a new Islamic kingdom. But of course, this is far from what it really was. But could you elaborate a little bit? Not just, you talked a little bit about this, but elaborate more if you could.
Sure. I mean, this is something that continues even beyond this period, but just to stick close to the period of Columbus and Cortez, the first few decades, there is, as I was describing before, a use of the language of Islam to filter the quote unquote new world into their minds, to help them to understand this vast difference that they're seeing. And I think part of the reason for that is that Islam was, for these European Christians, one of the great others, one of the great markers of difference in the old world. And so as they're grasping for some way of understanding this new place, they fall back on what they know as difference. And for them, one of the markers of difference is Islam. It's not the only one, but it's one of the most crucial, as I argue in the book. Another way in which Islam is relevant to this early European colonial history of the Caribbean is that very, very quickly Europeans understand that they need hands to work on plantations in the Caribbean, right? So this is in the first few decades in the early 16th century. And I go through the details of the back and forth between the colonists and the crown in Spain over how to meet that shortage. It becomes apparent pretty quickly that slaves from West Africa are going to be a part of this plantation of economy in the Caribbean. And there's a lot of back and forth about attempts to prevent the seizure of Muslim West Africans to take them to the New World. There's this notion, and it's very explicit in the correspondence between colonists in the Caribbean and the authorities in Spain, that they want to prevent the importation of Islam to the Caribbean. They see it as tabula rasa, as a non-Muslim space that they want to prevent from being tainted by this scourge of Islam. So there's a lot of back and forth, and this is the time of the Inquisition, we have to remember, in which trying to
I bet you did not expect that.
What's that?
I bet you did not expect the Inquisition.
Well, the way the Inquisition is relevant here, that the only reason I'm bringing it up in this particular context is that much of the Inquisition is about trying to find what is the true interior religiosity of people, right? Even if externally they pretend to be Christians, are they, in their heart of hearts, Jews or Muslims, right? A similar sort of thing happens with West Africans, of trying to figure out, are they really Muslims? Are they just acculturated as Muslims, etc.? And there is an effort to prevent bringing any kind of Muslim West Africans to the Caribbean. This, and again, I go into great detail in this in the book, this essentially fails, and it becomes very apparent very quickly to the colonists in a place like Hispaniola that many of the people they have forcibly brought to the New World from West Africa are indeed Muslims. So Mandingo, for example, from West Africa. And they use euphemisms like the bad customs of Islam. They express a fear that these Muslim slaves are, in their words, infecting other non-Muslim slaves, including some indigenous Americans, with again this disease of Islam in their view. So the fear of Islam is present at the very beginning. It is in some ways the motivation for the voyages, and it's there in the first few decades when the colonists are discussing slavery. It's there in the kinds of technology that is used in the Caribbean. So something like the press for crushing sugarcane has a history that comes from further east across Central Asia and then the Mediterranean. So there are multiple ways in which Islam impacts 1492 plus or minus a few decades, and then beyond that, of course, as well. And part of the effort of the book is to really reinsert that history into narratives about 1492. We don't tend to think about the fact that 1492 has anything to do with Islam. And so part of my book is to get us to think about that.
And let's go back to the Ottomans again. And I want to start with how you would become a sultan, because as you know, there would be, if you looked into Ottoman history, most sultans would have to kill their own brothers to become a sultan. But wasn't there anyone that thought, hey, maybe you're right, maybe we could get along? There wasn't anything like that.
Well, the Ottoman Empire is around for 600 years, so we can't speak, in absolute terms that fratricide occurred in all periods. It doesn't occur, especially later. It doesn't occur. But there are multiple instances in which it does occur, and it's not only the Ottomans in which this happened. Imperial families around the world, it's quite common for there to be quite bloody struggles within the family itself. So the Ottomans are not so different in that regard.
And now you open, after you've talked about the Portuguese expansion into the Americas, you open with his father, Selim's father, Bayezid versus Sem. Can you talk about their relationship and what it was like?
Yeah, so Bayezid and Jem is how the name is pronounced, are the sons of Mehmed the Conqueror, who is the Sultan who conquered Constantinople in 1453. And as often happened in succession crises after Mehmed died, there's a battle for who is going to take over from their father. And in this case, this is, a very interesting example of a succession crisis. Jem is quickly is put in the weaker position in the succession crisis. His brother is able to make a run on Istanbul, on Constantinople, before Cem is. I mean, this is usually how it goes. The first person to get to the palace wins. It's that basic.
You talked about the Janissaries as well playing a massive part in deciding who become the next sultan, right? So it's important to have the Janissaries on your side as well.
Absolutely. Having the military elite of the empire is obviously crucial. Cem, in his efforts to overcome his weak position, tries to make alliances with various powers. So this means that he goes to Cairo to try to make an alliance with the Mamluk Empire, which is another very important Muslim empire in the period, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in a little bit. He goes to France. He goes to the Pope. He kind of travels around the Mediterranean trying to better his hand in this succession crisis, and he eventually dies in Italy. And it's only then that Bayezid feels comfortable on the throne, that his brother is not going to come back and take over the throne from him.
Doesn't he get captured for a long time and have to spend months in prison? Not really prison, not to mention in the book, but more like comfortable prison, comfortable.
Yeah, that's right. He becomes a kind of bargaining chip for various European royal families in places like Rhodes and then in France again, in which Mehmet pays these families to keep Cem captive because he wants nothing to do with Cem. He wants Cem to go away. So he actually pays. Bayezid, his brother, pays these European powers to keep him in captivity. You're right. It's a very comfortable form of captivity because this is the person who's a part of a royal family after all. But nevertheless,
if you want to get captive, that's the way to get captured, be a prisoner.
That's right. This is a convenient way for Bayezid to sort of do away with Cem until he ultimately dies.
And how much time the space is, because it's quite some time he spent worrying about Cem and if he don't come back to take the throne, right? I think you said 14 years that he has to worry about Cem.
That's right. So Cem dies in 1495 in Naples, and Bayezid takes over the throne in 1481 when his father Mehmed dies. So yes, it's from 1481 to 1495, those 14 years that he has to worry about his brother.
Why didn't he send out assassins to kill his brother? Would that be possible at all? That he didn't want blood in his hand?
Yeah, I mean there are attempts to do that, especially when he's in Anatolia. There's a point in which Cem is in Anatolia and his brother, and we should say I've been saying brother, but it's really his half brother. They have the same father but different mothers. He does attempt to kill him. They take armies against each other. It's much harder when someone is in a foreign land to try to assassinate him.
Does Cem hope to get a throne eventually from Bayezid, or does it give up that this is not going to happen? I realize that now.
Yeah, I mean, the longer that he's traveling around the Mediterranean in these forms of captivity, the more he realizes that this is not going to happen. But he tries as best he can to make this happen. But I think it's pretty clear, after a few years of these attempts, and Bayezid's ability to solidify his place on the throne, that Cem is probably not going to be able to unseat him.
No, at this time, Selim is already born. He's around 15, I believe. He's old enough to become a governor, and as you mentioned, normal for the Sultan children is to become governors, to get experience to govern in case so you're ready to become Sultan. But I want to begin with Selim, with his relationship with, and I'm sorry if I say the name wrong here, Dulabar Hatuns. his
Yes.
mother. So how is the relationship between a future sultan and his mother? Because it seemed to be quite important in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it is a crucial relationship for any prince. So as I mentioned, just quickly in passing there, usually in the royal families, again, this isn't always the case, but usually there is, the sultan, and the sultan has both wives, legal wives, and concubines. These are female slaves that are usually captured through war, or are acquired through the slave market or something like that.
Now, you mentioned in the book as well that it was favored, actually, that the white European captive would be the mother of the future sultan, right?
Right. So the concubines are often Europeans of various kinds, sometimes from the Caucasus, sometimes from Russia, sometimes from the Balkans. And for reasons that aren't exactly clear to historians, you are right that it seems as though the sultans prefer to produce their heirs, the future sultans, from their concubines rather than from their wives. So the way it usually went, and this is probably part of the reason why, what I'm about to explain, is that once a concubine bore a son to a sultan, sexual relations between them ceased. So the kind of formula that we think about is one woman, one son. And once a slave woman, a concubine, has a son, their fates become bound together. Obviously, the legal status of being a slave is not an attractive one for anybody. But the fortunes of a slave woman would rise as the fortunes of her son rose. So that if a prince became sultan, then his mother would have a favored position within the imperial family. So concubines have a vested interest in their sons succeeding. And so you often see that there'll be the sultan and there will be multiple sons, because you can produce many sons from if you have many concubines. And so there'll be these kind of teams of mothers and sons vying for position within the imperial harem and then across the empire. And then even in succession battles, you'll have the mothers kind of helping their sons to win the throne. So in the case of Selim and his mother Gulbahar, who is a concubine, a slave woman, his father, Bayezid, has 10 sons. The eldest son dies and is not really relevant for the succession crisis. And Selim is the fourth son overall, but then the third son after the eldest dies. And those three sons are Ahmed, Korkut, and Selim in that order. So Selim is the third in line after his two older brothers. When he is 17, he and his mother are assigned to the governorship of the city of Trabzon, which is on the southeast corner of the Black Sea. So if one were to look at a map, this is about as far away from Constantinople as you can get and still be in the Ottoman Empire. It's the furthest east in the Ottoman Empire at that point. And that assignment of Selim to be governor, and we'll get back to what that means in a second, of this city already shows us that his father did not favor him to take over the throne. Because as I said before, proximity to Constantinople in the assignment of governorships in all capacities was an indication of how favored one was and how likely one was to take over the throne. So his two older brothers, especially his eldest surviving brother, Ahmed, is given a very plum governorship very close to the capital city. So Selim is assigned to this very far away city, one that has only recently been incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. The vast majority of the population is Greek Orthodox. And this is a place that doesn't have a long history of Ottoman rule at all. It's very newly acquired and incorporated into the empire. So for all kinds of reasons, it's not a very favorable posting. He's 17 when he goes there. So that was in some ways actually old for these sons to be assigned to be governors, because as you said, these assignments to princes of these positions was a way for them to prove themselves in the Ottoman Empire, a way for them to build up relationships that would ultimately be part of the competition to win the throne after their father died. The father died.
Was
So
the city a difficult city to govern, or was it that that why it
well,
was sent there because of the difficulty to govern and because it was fairly new to the Ottoman Empire?
It was, in the sense that, yes, it was newly incorporated into the empire. It didn't have any institutions, the normal institutions of Ottoman society, like soup kitchens, libraries, mosques, a court, these kinds of things. And we'll get to that in a second. But just to finish the thought on the assignment of governors, sometimes these boys are assigned at 7 years of age or 8 years of age. Again, they go with their mothers and a small retinue. So it's very clear, and you see this in the correspondence and in the records of these governorships, that it's really their mothers who play a very key role in governing these places, in the day-to-day affairs, in assigning people positions of power in the city, of dealing with disputes, because these governors, the official governors, the sons, are too young to take on these responsibilities. And it's through learning from their mothers that they come to understand how to govern. So again, the mothers are crucial to this story. In a place like Trabzon, Selim's mother, Gulbahar, is at the height of her power, really, while they are there in the city. She endows a pious foundation in the city that includes a mosque, a soup kitchen, a library, that becomes a central institution for turning Trabzon, or beginning the process of turning Trabzon from a Greek Orthodox Byzantine city into an Ottoman city. These institutions remake the landscape of the city. They provide social services that are associated with the Ottoman Empire. And this is her way of stamping her imprint on the city. And to this day, that pious foundation still exists. The mosque is still there, the soup kitchen, the library, and it's known as the Ladies' Foundation after Gulbahar. So in some ways, she does more to shape the city than Selim did.
Now, I want to go back a little bit and talk about the harem again, because what happened if she bore a daughter to the Sultan? What would happen to the daughter? I assume she would not attain governorship.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's a patriarchal society. So women do not have as many rights as men do. The daughters would often have very comfortable lives in the institution of the harem. Sometimes there would be a politics of marriage between sovereigns, sometimes outside of the Ottoman Empire, to create alliances. So those kinds of things happen. But the daughters of concubines do not attain high positions of power in the empire.
And let's continue on the Galabar's governorship, if to call it that, for the lack of a better word. How does she govern? She builds soup kitchens, as you mentioned, mosques. She's very highly valued. Does she let Selim govern as well, or does she kind of like, I'm the power behind the throne and Selim is her puppet in a way?
Yeah. So I mean, this changes over time. So Selim is in Trabzon longer than he's anywhere else in his life. He's made governor there at the age of 17 in 1487, and is governor until he takes the throne in 1512. So it's 25 years of his 50-year life he's in Trabzon. So over the course of that period, there's a gradual transition towards him being the actual power player in the city. When he's very young, it's mostly his mother. Of course, he kind of serves as a figurehead, but in the day-to-day affairs, she's really the one who's running things. But as he gets older and learns more and more about how to run a place and how the empire works and how to deal with, bickering bureaucrats and market regulations and taxation and these kinds of things, he takes over more and more of the administration of the city.
And is this where he gets his? I don't know his wife's. This very find his wife, to put it that way, because Solomon is also born during this time. Is that right?
That's right. So Suleiman, who will become Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the most famous sultan in Ottoman history, is Selim's son, born to a concubine in Trabzon in 1494. So yes, that's an important aspect of his time in the city. It's really, that period is obviously crucial. It's where he learns to cut his teeth as an administrator. It's where he builds military alliances. We're talking about Selim now, where he builds military alliances that will help him later on in the succession battle. He leads raids to the east against Georgia along the Black Sea, a very bloody raid in the early part of the 16th century. This is a frontier zone, as I said. It's again as far away from Constantinople as you can get. And this is a period during his time in Trabzon when the area to the east and the Caucasus and what is today northern Iran is a place of warfare and where people are vying for political power. And some of those battles spill over into the Ottoman Empire and into Trabzon. So he's constantly fending off these forces to the east. And I think it helps to shape his rule as sultan later, because he's really a militarily forward sultan. And I think it's from Trabzon that he builds that kind of ethos.
When does he realize that if I want to become, I'm not going to become sultan. He's not going to choose. My father is not going to choose me. I have to do something if I want to become sultan. And when does he start, as you said, to form alliances with several empires, cities, states? When does he realize that he has to do something about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's not a single crystal moment in which he realizes this. I think he knows enough about the history of the Ottoman Empire and about his family's politics, right? To know that he's third in line as the third son, the third surviving son. His posting very far away. All of these are very clear messages. The way that his father favors Ahmed, the eldest surviving son. All of these are messages that Selim is not high up in the potential to succeed his father. So I think in Trabzon is where he begins to think of alternative. Excuse me?
No, sorry, you were dropping out, but keep going.
It's in Trabzon that he begins to build an alternative base of power outside of the normal avenues of familial politics within the Ottoman dynasty, building alliances with parts of the military that have been not favored by the elite of the military, various tribal groups that have fought against the Ottoman Empire, disaffected soldiers and others. He builds this kind of motley crew of alliances in Trabzon that he uses sometimes as a foil against his father's empire. So in the Georgian raid that I discussed, those soldiers are taken from the non-elite of the military. They are ethnically Turks rather than the Janissaries, which are usually not ethnic Turks. And he speaks about these soldiers as being the kind of common folk of the empire, the real Ottomans, quote unquote, that haven't been corrupted by money or prestige or power in the way that the Janissaries and his father's group has. So he's already cutting a contrast between himself and his father, in the early years of the 16th century, a decade or so before, there's any inkling that there's going to be a succession crisis in the empire.
Now, as you mentioned in the book here, he cuts alliances with make an alliances, with the Kurds as well, right? Which is kind of still to this day in this area, outsiders and looked down upon. So, what made him make an alliance with the Kurds?
Yeah, I mean, it's various ethnic groups within Eastern Anatolia. Again, these are, the outsiders of the empire. And I don't want to overstate, how copacetic these kinds of alliances were. But there are points in which he is aligned with various Kurdish principalities and other ethnic groups within the empire. Later on, he will actually attack these groups, but they serve his interests during his time in Trabzon.
Do the Janissaries favor Selim? That it seemed to me like you explained that it did favor Selim. And why was this? Why would they favor him?
No. The Janissaries will later, but in this period in Trabzon, it's really the disaffected elements of the military that favor Selim, or that he's able to speak to in a way that is compelling to them. The Janissaries are really the elite. They are the Sultan's soldiers. The soldiers that he's speaking to are a different cadre of military force in the empire.
So I wanted to talk about his brothers for a little while, Ahmed and Turkit. So what did they do to gain the Ottoman throne, and how did they form alliances and to take the throne from his father? And the third question is who does it base in favor of the old history?
Right. So Bayezid favors Ahmed, the eldest surviving son, and he gives him a governorship very close to Constantinople. When he's young, he is bringing him into important meetings. He gives him all of the favors that a budding sultan would need. The way that Korkut is described is he's kind of described as being more cerebral. He likes reading, he likes philosophy, he likes poetry. His head is in the clouds. This is how the sources describe him. And Selim is in some ways an afterthought. So it's really Ahmed's throne to get. If in 1510 or 1511, most people would have assumed that Ahmed would be the one to succeed his father.
Does he? Because he seemed to describe me as going a little bit crazy and just randomly deciding that I'm going to create my own empire, and that I'm going to be Sultan of.
Yeah, he gets angry later when it's clear that he's not going to be able to get the throne. But I wouldn't describe him as crazy. I would describe him more as simply assuming that the throne would come to him, right? That he didn't have to struggle to get the throne. He just, he was complacent, right? Thinking that it would come to him very easily. He didn't have to do anything about it. Don't worry about it. I'm going to get the throne.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you a little what-if question here. How do you think you would have been as a sultan, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I mean, the short answer is I have no idea. I mean, I think, let me answer the question maybe this way, is that it's clear that he would not have done what Selim ended up doing when he became sultan. And I think that's because Selim had a different trajectory to the throne than most other sultans before him, if not all of them, in the sense that he wasn't the most favored. He had this experience in the East. He had one surviving sultan in Suleiman. He has a very different stance towards the empire than most sultans did. Ahmed, I think, would have continued very much in his father's vein, consolidating borders, fighting off enemies. He would not have been as expansionist as Selim ended up being. I don't think he would have been as violent as Selim. It's the counterfactual. We'll never know, of course, but to speculate, I would say that he would basically continue in the vein of Bayezid.
How does a fight against Ahmed and Selim go? So obviously we know, but could you talk about a Selim versus Ahmed, and how does Ahmed try to start his new empire?
Yeah. Okay. So, I won't go blow by blow in terms of how, Selim gains the throne, but suffice it to say that, it's very clear Bayezid is His days are waning. There are signs that he's getting ready to give over the throne to Ahmed. Selim gets wind of this. He calls upon some of the alliances he made with elements of the military, and he has to figure out how to get from Trabzon to Constantinople, again, very, very far away. He uses the pretense of a governorship for his son, Suleiman, as a way of getting closer to Constantinople, physically closer. So he asks his father to assign Suleiman to a governorship in the Balkans, very close to Constantinople, a very choice governorship. Bayezid refuses that. There's a negotiation about this governorship. Eventually, it's decided that he will be made governor in Crimea, in the northern Black Sea. So not very close to Constantinople, but as good as they can get. So Selim accompanies Suleiman to his governorship to kind of drop him off in Crimea. And in Crimea, he organizes this march down the western coast of the Black Sea towards Constantinople. Along the way, he sends threatening letters to his father saying, I'm coming to get you, kind of thing. Ahmed, of course, gets wind of this and tries to mobilize his forces to get to Constantinople before Selim does. Selim reaches the city first, and in a remarkable turn of events, sort of storms the castle, enters forcibly into the Topkapi Palace, the seat of the Ottoman Sultan, and forces his father to give up the throne, and threatens him. This is highly unusual in the imperial politics of the Ottoman Empire. Never happened in this way before. As part of this crisis, Ahmed has forces in the city. Ahmed is not in the city already, but he has kind of his men in the city, and Selim has his men. There's kind of gang warfare in the streets of Constantinople. Eventually, Bayezid sees the writing on the wall and steps down from the throne, giving it over to Selim. Selim is now faced with an unprecedented situation in which he is now the sitting sultan, and there is a former sultan who's still alive and has capacity to rule, but has been deposed. Usually sultans only were removed if they died or became physically or mentally incapacitated. That was not the case here. So Selim has to figure out, what am I going to do with my father? It's eventually decided that he will be sent to a kind of forced retirement in a town in what is today Greece. As he's sent off, he dies on the road to this town. So there's a lot.
And I hear this is where I want to ask you, because you mentioned that he may have killed him himself, that he poisoned him. Do you believe that is the truth, or do you believe that he may have had a heart attack, as you mentioned in the book?
We will never know. I mean, we will never know. So some historians say, yes, Selim had either had him poisoned or had one of his men kill him on the road. Some say, Bayezid died of heartbreak on the road. There are several theories. I think, ultimately we will never know. But whatever the case, it's quite convenient for Selim, right? There's circumstantial evidence that would suggest that he had an interest in being gone with Bayezid for the reasons that I cited already. And so Bayezid is quickly, out of the picture. You suggested that Ahmed had raised his own army and his own kind of mini empire. That is true. So after Selim takes the throne, Ahmed is very angry, and this is where he might get a little crazed. And he builds up his own forces in Anatolia, in Western Anatolia, and proclaims himself to be Sultan of Western Anatolia, and that he is going to come to Constantinople and defeat his brother. So his brother, obviously can't have that stand. There's only one sultan. So for the first year of his reign, of Selim's reign, he is attempting to eliminate both Ahmed and Korkut.
You meant this is the part again in the book where I forget the name of the empire. It's a Shia empire that he forms an alliance with. Some people may know what I'm referring to, but do talking about the alliance with the Shia Empire.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. So if I mentioned before that, when Selim was governor of Trabzon, that there were all kinds of different groups fighting in eastern, to the east of Trabzon in the Caucasus, northern Iran. One of the groups that comes out of that will eventually form the Safavid Empire in 1501 in northern Iran and the Caucasus. And they are enemies of the Ottomans. Ahmed contemplates an alliance with the Safavids to help him to get the throne from Selim, right?
And he ultimately sends his son there as well.
That's right. And a couple of his sons actually go to the Safavid court. So, for Selim, this is further evidence of Ahmed's bankruptcy, right? That he's aligning with this sworn enemy of the Ottomans and attempting to use this empire against the Ottoman Empire.
Do you think it was a strategic reason he did this, or do you think Selim was right, that it was bankrupt and desperate measures?
There's certainly evidence that Ahmed attempts an alliance with the Safavids, and that some of his sons and other men go to the Safavid court. No, that's clear. I think it's part of Ahmed's strategy of he needs support, he needs a fighting force, he needs allies, and so he's searching for them where he can.
And how does this alliance work out?
Not very well. It doesn't help Ahmed. He's eventually caught and killed. Both Korkut and Ahmed are killed by Selim in 1513. So after he gains the throne in 1512, the next year. And once they're eliminated, Selim, in the same way that once Jem was eliminated, Bayezid felt confident on the throne. Once Selim's half brothers are eliminated, he is fully in control of the empire at that point.
Now, talk about how he murdered Korkut, because it's quite brutal the way that he murders his other brother.
Yeah, the actual details of it I'm not recalling at the moment. Both of them are strangled. I believe they're both strangled. I would have to go back to the book to see exactly.
You mentioned that he is strangled in the cave, that he just walked out and the kind of is this. Sorry, I forget the word. He is disgusted by him in a way.
Yep. Yeah. No, Selim is a part of going after his half brothers. The actual moment of death was probably carried out by one of his men, but Selim is a brutal guy, and he wants his brothers gone.
So he takes his final Sultan, and he got rid of his brothers at last. And how old is he at this point, and what does he do next?
Yeah, so this is 1513. Once his brothers are eliminated, he is 43 years old at this point. Selim's reign is only 8 years, 1512 to 1520. He spends remarkably most of it fighting in the east of the empire. This is another thing that makes him unique in Ottoman history. All of his battles are against Eastern enemies. So after the elimination of his brothers, he, in the very next year, 1514, leads a campaign against the Safavid Empire that we were just discussing. And this is known as the Battle of Chalderon, after the city in which this battle took place. He marches an enormous army all the way across Anatolia. So if you think of the modern nation state of Turkey, all the way from Istanbul to, through the modern borders to a city in northern Iran, the city of Chalderon. And the Ottoman army and the Safavid army meet there. It's a very quick, bloody battle, an enormous victory that the Ottomans strike, a decisive victory for Selim early in his reign against one of his major rivals in the Middle East. And there's a major setback for the Safavids. This campaign is also very, very important because Selim leads one of the largest domestic massacres in Ottoman history before the end of the 19th century against Shiite communities in Anatolia. They are described as being allies of the Shiite Safavids, right, as internal enemies, as others that need to be eliminated. So this is, further evidence of just how violent Selim was, that he massacred up to 40,000, if not more, of his own subjects.
Now, I think it's important to mention the most Islamic law, that Islamists were not allowed to kill other Islamics, as you mentioned in the book again, but against other non-Islamic was okay. So what makes this okay that Selim couldn't go against the Shiites?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of ways to answer that. One is, there's what's written on paper and there's what is actually done, right? I mean, the 10 Commandments say thou shalt not lie, but, people lie all the time. So, Muslims battled Muslims all the time. That's nothing surprising there. Selim, though, does have his religious authorities issue fatwas, religious edicts, describing Shiites as apostates, as treasonous, as even non-Muslim, and thereby sanctioning violence against them. So he does feel the need to have a religious pretext to go after Shiites.
And something I wanted to talk about next is because, for those who may not know or haven't read the book yet, which you should, by the way, it's brilliant. So a sultan and in the Ottoman Empire did not be crowned caliph like the Umayyads. They were caliphs, right? So why did not an Ottoman be crowned caliph? And I want to get into the Mamluk and Ottoman relations next.
Yeah, well, again, there is the sort of legal details of what it means to be caliph and the institution of the caliphate. And then there are what sovereigns claimed themselves to be. Now, to be caliph, the technical definition of being caliph is he who holds Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam. In this period, it was the Mamluk Empire, the empire I mentioned when we were discussing gems, centered in Cairo, and that rules parts of North Africa, Egypt, parts of Syria, and then the Hejaz, the region on the eastern coast of the Red Sea in what is today Saudi Arabia, that houses Mecca and Medina. So, being caliph is, among other things, a rhetorical sanction for a Muslim ruler, and this will enter into Selim's politics later on.
What would the power be if you became caliph as well as sultan? Was this the highest honor you could get in the Islamic world?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of titles a Muslim leader can have, that is certainly amongst the highest, right? It makes you custodian of the holy places, right? Mecca and Medina are places where Muslims around the world come to every year. This is the place where people face when they pray 5 times a day. So the sponsorers of that holiness possess a lot of power.
And now Selim does seem to, because they seem to have quite a decent relationship, I would say, according to yourself, until Selim. But what reason does he have to go to war against the Mamluk Empire?
Yeah. There are a couple of reasons. I mean, one is I think his sheer ambition to triumph over others. There is a sort of contingent reason that along their long border between the Ottomans and the Mamluks in kind of what is today northern Syria. There are skirmishes across the border back and forth all the time, raids going in either direction. There are rumors that the Safavids and the Mamluks are thinking about an alliance against the Ottomans. Selim sees his victory at Chalderon as boding very well for his military future. He wants to secure the eastern half of his empire, right, against the Safavids, but then also against the Mamluks. It would, if the Ottomans were to conquer the Mamluks, it would provide them not only massive territory, but also access to trade routes to the east, to secure the eastern portion of the Mediterranean. There are all kinds of reasons for Selim to invade the Mamluk Empire. I think ultimately, though, it's what I said initially, that he has this ambition to be a kind of leader who uses military force against his enemies. And you see that throughout his life.
How he does such, and like you said, it's there's passions. So how does he win over the Mamluk and conquer at last Mecca and Medina?
Right. So again, I go blow by blow in the book. I won't repeat it here. But in 1516, he begins marching towards Cairo, the Mamluk capital. There are battles all along the way through Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Sinai, eventually reaching Cairo. Selim enters Cairo in 1517, seizes the Mamluk capital, and legally and officially the Mamluk Empire is no longer, and that territory becomes Ottoman territory. Of course, none of this happens overnight. This is a gradual process over decades, but this is the initial seizure of the Mamluk Empire and its official incorporation into the Ottoman Empire in 1517. So all of that territory, North Africa, Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, Mecca and Medina, becomes officially a part of the Ottoman Empire. This almost triples the territory of the Ottoman Empire. It completely changes the demographics of the empire, making it a majority Muslim empire. It puts the Ottomans for the first time into the Red Sea and therefore into the Indian Ocean, into Northern Africa. It gives the Ottoman Empire the shape that it will have roughly until World War I. This is the largest single territorial expansion in 600 years of Ottoman history.
And as you said, they are the closest to return for the Roman Empire since the Roman Empire.
Right.
And something that you mentioned in the book as well is that at this point, coffee become kind of a relevant trade for the Ottomans. How does that come about? What does coffee have to do with the Ottomans?
Yeah. So as part of this seizure in 1516 and 1517 of the Mamluk Empire, the Ottomans take Yemen on the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. Again, the full incorporation of Yemen will take several decades, but this is the moment when it begins. And in Yemen, the Ottomans come across coffee. Now, coffee beans had come most likely from Ethiopia across the Red Sea, several centuries, maybe decades previously. It was known in Yemen from Ethiopia. And it's there that the Ottomans come across coffee for the first time. The unity of the Ottoman Empire from Yemen, very far south, up through Syria, across North Africa, into the Middle East, through Anatolia, into the Balkans, and into Southeastern Europe. That political, social, cultural, institutional unity eventually allows coffee to spread up from Yemen throughout all of that territory. And eventually, a few decades after 1517, you come to see that there are new institutions established devoted solely to the consumption of coffee. So coffee houses or cafes are essentially an Ottoman innovation that could only happen because of Selim's conquest in 1516, 1517, and the entrance of coffee into the Ottoman world.
Did I think we take it for granted that the Ottomans actually has so much to say about this little drink that everyone drink today?
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to what we spoke about at the very, very beginning of trying to think about how the Ottoman Empire is relevant to world history. And this is, we might say a small indication of that, but obviously a very huge indication of that. Coffee is drunk all over the world. We put it in our bodies. There's massive fortunes that are built on the backs of coffee, institutions, trade networks, medicinal understandings of the world, all of that, everything that's attached to coffee in some ways has an Ottoman history, and we owe lots of the kind of attributes of coffee to the Ottomans. So, in citing the coffee example, this is one of the ways in which I think this period of Ottoman history is important for us to understand our world.
As mentioned as well, Selim is hardly in Constantinople at all during his sultanship and in his lifetime even. So he doesn't really feel comfortable there. And soon after he conquers Medina and Mecca, there is a plague coming. So let's talk a little bit about his final days as well.
Yeah. So you're right that in the 8 years that he's sultan, he spends most of it outside of the royal palace. At war against the Safavids and then the Mamluks. He comes back to Istanbul in 1518 after his war with the Mamluks, after Cairo has been secured. And very, very soon after he arrives, there's a plague outbreak in Istanbul. Plague was a very common occurrence in the world, not just in the Ottoman Empire, but in lots of places. With echoes to our present day, one of the ways that you deal with plague, if you have the means, is to run away from it, right? And so he leaves Istanbul shortly after arriving to Edirne, which is the old Ottoman capital in the Balkans, further west from Istanbul. And the Ottomans have many institutions there. There are hunting lodges, palaces, various things. So this was a common place for sultans to go for leisure and just to get out of the city. So he goes there, if you like, his kind of vacation spot in late 1518 to escape the plague. And he spends his remaining days in Edirne, doing the things that sultans do. He falls ill.
It theorized that he did get a plague, that it may have gotten the plague while he was in Istanbul, right?
So he falls ill after about a year and a half in Edirne. We don't know exactly how he died. Some people think he contracted plague either when he was in Constantinople before he left, or after being in Edirne for a period. Some think that he could have contracted anthrax from his horse, which was a common occurrence. However, whatever it was, he had a disease that would eventually lead to his death. When he falls sick in Edirne, his physician suggests going back to Istanbul because he can get better medical care there. And it's on the road back to Istanbul where he dies in 1520, September 1520.
And we don't have to talk. Solomon, of course, will be his own episode eventually. But what do you think makes Solomon a favorite study among historians? And you mentioned this as well, that Selim is mostly overlooked, but he's really what shaped, to put it this way, the modern Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, so I think Suleiman is set up very well by his father, Selim. Selim has just the one son, Suleiman, surviving into adulthood. So that in and of itself saves Suleiman the succession crisis that sultans had to deal with, that took a lot of energy, that sapped years from their sultanate, all of those kinds of things. So he saved that stress at the very beginning. He benefits from this huge territorial expansion that Selim had just won for the empire. Suleiman now possesses more territory than any previous sultan had, thanks to his father. He has the trade routes. He has this increased population size. He has the prestige of holding the holy cities. He has an expanded army. He has new institutions that Selim's expansion made necessary. So in some ways, he's benefiting from Selim's territorial expansion. Part of that expansion part of the importance of the expansion is that it makes the Ottomans much more relevant to European powers. They are much more cognizant of Ottoman power that now stretches from Algeria all the way around the Mediterranean to Venice or Albania. And so Suleiman is engaged in this diplomatic correspondence with European powers in a way that no previous Ottoman Sultan was, because of the sheer increase in Ottoman power, thanks to Selim. Selim didn't have enough time on the throne to do any of the things that Suleiman will eventually do. I don't want to say that everything Suleiman did was thanks to Selim. Of course not. Suleiman is the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history. He does many important things over the course of his reign, from the arts to dynastic politics to war. But he gets a head start thanks to Selim. And I would argue that he could not have done the things he did without the massive territorial expansion that Selim had won.
Is this the point, like the Roman Empire eventually realized that we are too large, we can't expand anymore without collapsing completely? Is this kind of the same situation with after Selim, that they don't expand anymore? They try Vienna, but they fail, of course.
Yeah, no, the Ottomans do expand after, they continue to expand after this period. I mean, not the percentage increases that Selim was able to win, but in Iraq to the east, the Ottomans gain territory. Sometimes they lose it, sometimes they gain it again. And then in Eastern Europe, so in Hungary, and as you say, even to the gates of Vienna, temporarily, of course. But there is expansion, but it's at the edges, and it's never the amount that Selim had conquered.
And at the end of the book, I thought this was fascinating, and I wanted to ask you about this because you draw similarities between the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, and Selim. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, he makes it very, very obvious. Erdogan. What I point to at the end of the book is the following. People who have been to Istanbul know that the Bosphorus runs through the city. There previously were only two bridges that span the Bosphorus Straits. The Bosphorus Straits is an enormous waterway. Building a bridge over it is a massive undertaking. And so there were two bridges previously over the Bosphorus. The first one was called the Bosphorus Bridge, not surprisingly. The second was named after Mehmed the Conqueror, so Selim's grandfather, the Sultan who conquered Constantinople. Also, probably not so surprising in the sense that this is the Ottoman Sultan who brought the city into the empire. During Erdogan's reign, a third Bosphorus bridge was constructed, massive, one of the largest bridges in the world. And Erdogan could have named the bridge anything. He could have named it after himself. He could have named it after any figure from Ottoman history or from, I don't know, Muslim history or history generally. He could have given it a descriptive name. He chooses to name it after Selim. So this begs an explanation. I think Selim is relevant for Erdogan for the following reasons. One is the massive territorial expansion that we discussed. Erdogan very much sees himself as a kind of regional figure, right? As a major player in the Middle East. Turkey has military and economic interests in places in the Gulf. in places like Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, obviously, in the Caucasus. So that kind of regional power, expansionary power, if you like. Erdogan sees echoes of that in Selim. This melding of secular power and religious power that, Selim wins Mecca and Medina for the Ottomans. Erdogan very much styles himself as an Islamist leader of Turkey. And so Selim, again, is useful in those kinds of ways. I think Selim's violence towards his enemies, both foreign and domestic, is also an example of power that Erdogan is happy to try to emulate, that he will be forceful in his rule in the country. And we've seen that in all kinds of ways, in the jailing of dissidents and journalists, and then outside of Turkey in the various wars that Turkey is involved in currently. So in these ways, Selim is symbolically useful to Erdogan. For American listeners, in the same way that Trump invoked Andrew Jackson quite regularly, I think Erdogan does a similar thing with Selim. This example from the past of the kind of, in Trump's case, American power, in Erdogan's case, Turkish power, Ottoman power, really, but for him, Turkish power, that these historical figures represent.
And do you think that he secretly wished to bring back the Ottoman Empire? That he wished not to call it the Ottoman Empire instead of Turkey?
No. Actually conquering territory in the middle. No, I think Erdogan understands that that's an impossibility. There isn't a sense of wanting to reconstitute the Ottoman Empire. I do think he's interested in projecting Turkish power into the world, and we could say that has something to do with the Ottoman Empire or not. I mean, many countries want to project their power into the world. He's interesting. Erdogan is for many reasons, but one that's relevant here is unlike many leaders of Republican Turkey, so since 1923, Erdogan has very much embraced the Ottoman Empire in a very specific way. Only parts of the Ottoman Empire, the parts that are useful for him. It's selective and historically inaccurate in lots of ways, but nevertheless, he's embraced the Ottomans in ways other Republican leaders have not, because I think he sees it as a well of authority, historic power, of pride for Turkey, that Turkey should very much hold close rather than trying to distance itself from that Ottoman past in the way that leaders had over the course of the 20th century.
Is he one of the reasons? Because there's been recently quite a lot of Ottoman TV shows in Turkey set in the Ottoman Empire, and is he part of the reason that he's trying to embrace the Ottoman past? Sure. We see so much Ottoman series and movies in Turkey right now.
Sure. For sure. I mean, there's the phenomenon of neo-Ottomanism that many people identify. And this is certainly a part of it, the kind of soft power that comes from soap operas and TV series. So, we were talking about Suleiman, one of the most famous soap operas around the world is one based on the life of Suleiman and the woman that he will eventually marry. It's called The Magnificent Century. This is a soap opera that has been dubbed in multiple languages that, from Mexico to Greece to Pakistan is on TV, and in many ways serves as a way for Turkey to, again, project its face into the world.
Do you think this is mostly propaganda, or do they?
No, it's not propaganda. I mean, I think of it as kind of soft power, a kind of cultural power, in the same way that, if people around the world are drinking Coca-Cola and wearing, American blue jeans, that, serves American interests in a kind of cultural way, right? That America is important and produce these things. And
I mean, it's kind of a, do you think, I think in a way that this becomes so popular with Ottoman TV shows that people started to get interested and look into the actual influence and want to look into the history of the Ottoman Empire, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes both ways. I mean, if what people see on TV is all they know about the Ottoman Empire,
Yeah.
then that's a very skewed picture. But if it encourages them to read more deeply and to delve into sources and other books, then yes, that's a good thing.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on this show. And before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote, any social media or any links you wish me to put in the description?
No, thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I encourage people to seek the book out. It's available in multiple languages, I'm easily findable online if people have any questions.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure as well. And my name is Alan. You can find us on social media on Instagram, well, that aged well, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you can find podcasts. Next week, we are going to lean into with the YouTube channel Hikmah History, and we're going to talk about the modernization of Afghanistan. My name is Alan. This has been Well That Aged Well. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we see you next time.